It was meant to be Donald Trump's victory lap, a triumphant moment where he could declare that he had forced America's biggest companies to bring jobs back home. But instead of applause, he was blindsided. Two of the nation's most iconic brands, John Deere and Ford, turned their backs on him. What started as a bold campaign to make America build again quickly spiraled into an economic knife fight, leaving Trump scrambling. John Deere, the pride of rural America, quietly announced it was moving some of its production overseas. Trump tried to push back, attempting to shame them into submission. But before he could regain his footing, Ford, Detroit's proudest symbol, followed suit. The automaker slashed domestic investments and doubled down on its operations abroad. Trump called it a betrayal. He threatened tariffs, promised retribution, and warned that no American brand would get away with defying him. But Deere and Ford didn't flinch. Their response wasn't loud. It was calculated, strategic, and devastating. They played the long game, and they played it well. Now the real questions linger. Why did two of the most patriotic companies in America stand their ground? How did Trump's retaliation not only fail, but backfire so spectacularly? And in the fallout, who's paying the price as chaos ripples through America's auto and agricultural sectors? It all came to a head at a rally in Des Moines, Iowa. A packed crowd gathered expecting Trump's usual fiery rhetoric on border security and economic nationalism. But what they got instead was something far more explosive. Standing before thousands of cheering supporters, Trump made a stunning announcement: a 200% tariff on all John Deere products manufactured outside the U.S., and a 25% blanket tariff on all imported Ford vehicles and auto parts. This wasn't a warning or a negotiating tactic. It was a declaration of war. Trump framed the tariffs as a bold, patriotic move against corporate greed. If these companies want to sell to American workers, he declared, they will build in America, or they will pay the price. The crowd roared with approval. But beyond the applause, economists and industry leaders were stunned. No American president had ever proposed tariffs of that magnitude against homegrown corporations. The economic consequences were immediate. Analysts warned that the tariffs could add an average of $10,000 to the cost of a Ford vehicle. John Deere's prices were expected to spike by 20 to 30%, putting essential farming equipment out of reach for many. Within hours, Wall Street reacted. Ford's stock tumbled, and Deere's market value plummeted by more than $10 billion in just 1 week. But the true cost wasn't just measured in stock prices. It was political and deeply personal. Trump's tariff bombshell didn't just target two companies. It hit the entire American supply chain. Auto factories, farm equipment dealerships, and parts suppliers across the Midwest were thrown into uncertainty. And the people left to deal with the aftermath weren't executives or politicians. They were everyday Americans, workers, farmers, and small-town families. Yet even as prices surged and headlines dominated the news cycle, one group felt the sting of this economic war more than anyone else: the very people Trump had vowed to protect. And here's the thing, this was only the beginning. The deeper you dig into the story, the more it becomes clear just how badly this fight spiraled out of control. So if you want to stay ahead of the chaos, to really understand how these battles play out in real time, make sure you stay locked in, because what's coming next is something you won't want to miss. In small towns scattered across Iowa, Michigan, and Wisconsin, tension was thick in the air. These were communities that had long stood behind Trump, drawn in by his promises to revive manufacturing and shield rural America from the crushing weight of corporate greed and globalization. But now, as Ford and John Deere dug in their heels and Trump doubled down, those same communities found themselves trapped in the middle of an escalating economic war. For farmers, the blow was especially personal. Many had relied on John Deere equipment for generations. The tractors, harvesters, financing plans, and repair services were the backbone of their operations. But now, thanks to the tariffs, those machines were about to get a lot more expensive. Some farmers were left wondering if they could even afford to replace or repair aging equipment. The sense of loyalty they once felt toward Deere and the faith they placed in Trump's economic vision began to crack. Factory workers in places like Michigan and Ohio faced a different kind of fear. The tariffs were meant to punish Ford for shifting production overseas, but the consequences weren't so neatly contained. America's auto industry operates through a vast, tangled web of global supply chains. Even U.S.-made cars rely on parts from countries like Mexico, Brazil, and Canada. As the new tariffs loomed, Ford issued warnings about potential layoffs and even plant closures, not because of foreign competition, but because the entire supply chain was being destabilized by Trump's aggressive stance. What started as a patriotic stand to defend American manufacturing had morphed into something far more complicated and far more painful. Families who once cheered at campaign rallies were now feeling the pressure in their paychecks, their budgets, and their futures. Conversations around kitchen tables turned tense. Resentment began to build, not just toward the corporations they once trusted, but toward the president they had believed in. And just when it seemed like rural America couldn't bear any more fallout, the backlash erupted into something even bigger, something no one saw coming. But the boycott was only the beginning. What started as a political statement quickly morphed into a full-blown rebellion, right in the heart of Trump country. When Donald Trump stood on that stage in Iowa and accused John Deere of betraying American farmers, he didn't mince words. He told his supporters that Deere had stabbed them in the back by shifting manufacturing to Mexico and India. And then, with unmistakable clarity, he told them what to do. Stop buying Deere. The crowd erupted. The message spread like wildfire. Within days, calls to boycott one of America's most iconic farming brands swept through rural communities across the country. At first, the idea of farmers turning their backs on John Deere seemed unthinkable. For generations, green and yellow machines had been more than just tools. They were symbols of American agriculture, deeply woven into the fabric of rural life. But now, farmers were faced with a gut-wrenching choice: stand with Trump or stand with Deere. And many chose Trump. Across the Midwest and the South, farmers began canceling orders. Dealerships reported a sharp decline in foot traffic. Online groups and forums exploded with boycott chatter. Facebook pages, local radio shows, and even conversations at the local co-op turned into battlegrounds filled with heated debates about loyalty, betrayal, and the future of American manufacturing. This wasn't just internet noise, it had real-world consequences. Small-town dealerships saw sales nosedive. Mechanics who built their businesses around servicing Deere equipment found their appointment books suddenly empty. Meanwhile, farmers who had only ever used John Deere gear began exploring alternatives. Brands like Case IH, Kubota, and New Holland started getting serious looks. And it didn't stop at tractors. The boycott extended to hats, shirts, and all kinds of merchandise. Items that once flew off the shelves now sat gathering dust. Deere's signature green wasn't just fading from the fields. It was disappearing from closets, truck bumpers, and storefront windows. The rebellion had begun, and John Deere was feeling the heat from a place it never expected: its own backyard. What began as a political protest quickly evolved into something far more powerful: an economic weapon. And the people wielding it weren't outsiders or pundits. They were the very Americans John Deere had served for more than a century. The backlash didn't fade, it intensified. Trump supporters across rural America organized tractor parades featuring only non-Deere equipment. Videos of farmers spray painting over the iconic green and yellow logos went viral, turning symbols of loyalty into statements of defiance. Rural talk radio stations began running daily segments, urging listeners to buy American and punish Deere for its so-called betrayal. The irony, of course, was hard to miss. Many of the alternatives farmers turned to, like Kubota and Mahindra, were themselves foreign-owned and manufactured abroad. But this wasn't about logic. It was about loyalty, pride, political revenge. As the boycott gained steam, John Deere's leadership found itself under siege. Local dealerships were demanding answers. Mayors in small towns feared what a collapse in sales could mean for already struggling economies. And at Deere's corporate headquarters, the reality began to set in. They had severely underestimated how personal this fight had become. They believed global economics would prevail over political noise. Instead, they were staring down an existential threat, one rising up not from Washington or Wall Street, but from their own customer base. And the chaos wasn't confined to the backroads and farm fields. What happened next sent shockwaves through the very heart of American capitalism: Wall Street. While farmers were burning bridges with Deere, the financial elite were preparing for their own kind of firestorm. The moment Trump dropped his 200% tariff threat on Deere's overseas manufactured equipment, the markets reacted as if a bomb had gone off. Deere stock didn't just dip, it cratered. By the end of that week, the company had lost more than 22% of its market value, wiping out billions in shareholder equity. Investors panicked. Analysts scrambled. What had been a symbolic protest in rural America had turned into a financial bloodbath. The message was clear. This wasn't just a political feud. It was a full-blown economic war, and no one, not even one of America's most legendary companies, was safe from the fallout. But the pain wasn't limited to John Deere. Ford was hit just as hard, maybe even harder. As Trump announced a sweeping 25% tariff on all imported vehicles and auto parts, Ford stock took a beating. Investors weren't reacting to politics. They were reacting to instability. Wall Street doesn't care about nationalist slogans or campaign rally applause. It cares about profits, growth, and predictability. And Trump's escalating economic war threatened all three. On CNBC and Bloomberg, analysts raised red flags. Some warned that the tariffs could tip the already fragile manufacturing sector into a full-blown recession. Hedge funds began offloading shares. Mutual fund managers were inundated with anxious calls from clients. In a matter of hours, the Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged more than 600 points. Inside corporate boardrooms, the atmosphere turned frantic. At Deere, executives scrambled to reassure investors, holding emergency meetings and hastily arranged press conferences. Ford's leadership huddled in late-night strategy sessions, frantically trying to model the long-term damage. Emails flew between CEOs, trade associations, and government officials, everyone asking the same question. How far was Trump really willing to go? That question got its answer soon enough. At another rally, Trump made it crystal clear. Any American company that moved jobs overseas would face the same punishment. No exceptions. No negotiations. Wall Street's worst fears were confirmed. This wasn't just about punishing two companies. It was about reshaping the entire future of American manufacturing through economic threats and public pressure. The fallout spread quickly. Bonds tied to auto and agricultural companies were downgraded. Pension funds began quietly pulling money from manufacturing-heavy portfolios. International investors started divesting from U.S. manufacturing stocks altogether, spooked by the prospect of a long-term trade war that could drag down American industry. The political war Trump had launched was now evolving into a full-scale economic disaster. But amid the chaos, as markets cratered and corporate leaders scrambled, there were some who remained eerily quiet, watching, waiting, and ready to strike. Because while Wall Street was melting down, the real winners weren't in Washington. They were somewhere else entirely. John Deere's misfortune quickly became a golden opportunity for its rivals, and they didn't hesitate to pounce. As the boycott took hold and Deere's reputation crumbled in rural communities, companies like Case IH and Kubota sprang into action. With precision timing, they launched targeted ad campaigns aimed squarely at Trump's base. Case IH ran spots on conservative talk radio and rural TV stations, branding themselves as the true American farming partner. Meanwhile, Kubota flooded social media with patriotic imagery, subtle jabs at Deere's so-called betrayal, and enticing trade-in promotions for farmers ready to leave their green machines behind. These weren't just marketing pushes, they were psychological plays. The rivalry had turned emotional. The messaging was sharp but strategic. Case IH and Kubota didn't need to get political. They didn't have to invoke Trump or name-drop Deere directly. Instead, they leaned into the growing sentiment that many farmers were feeling. Pride bruised, trust broken, loyalty lost. While Deere floundered in scandal and corporate spin, these companies painted themselves as the brands farmers could still count on. It worked. Within weeks of the boycott peaking, Case IH and Kubota reported double-digit sales growth across key rural markets. Dealerships were overwhelmed with demand. Farmers who had never before considered straying from Deere were now walking into showrooms, ready to switch. Even other foreign brands like Mahindra and New Holland, despite having overseas production, saw a surge in interest. The boycott had gone beyond just equipment. It had become a movement, a statement, a reckoning. And it wasn't just the farming sector that shifted. Ford's competitors were watching, too. General Motors and Stellantis quietly launched incentive programs of their own, offering discounts and trade-in bonuses to drivers looking to dump their Ford vehicles in favor of American-made alternatives. At the same time, foreign automakers like Toyota and Hyundai, largely shielded from Trump's tariffs thanks to their U.S. factories, pushed a new narrative of their own, positioning their cars as the smart, stable, American choice in a time of uncertainty. The message was everywhere, even if unspoken. If the giants fall, others are ready to rise. And in the shadows of the political firestorm, they were doing just that. The collapse of John Deere and Ford's rural market share wasn't a slow, quiet decline. It was a feeding frenzy. As their once loyal customers fled, competitors seized every opportunity, and behind the scenes, corporate executives across the country were already preparing for the next phase, a complete reshuffling of America's manufacturing landscape. But the biggest crisis wasn't just falling sales or stock prices. It was the unraveling of the very thing that kept America's factories alive, the supply chains. Trump's tariff war didn't just slap a surcharge on foreign-made goods. It blew a hole straight through the arteries of American industry. When his 200% tariff on John Deere's overseas equipment and 25% tariff on imported auto parts kicked in, the result wasn't just economic, it was systemic. Supply chains that had taken decades to build suddenly buckled. For years, American manufacturers had relied on a tightly woven global web of suppliers. Tractor parts from Mexico, steel from Germany, wiring harnesses from Brazil. These weren't luxuries, they were necessities. John Deere's factories depended on these precision parts to build their machines. Ford assembly lines couldn't run without thousands of foreign-made components. And overnight, those parts became harder to get, more expensive, or just completely unavailable. Ports backed up. Shipments stalled. Suppliers in Mexico and Canada backed out, confused and cautious under the new tariff landscape. Raw materials became scarce. Prices soared. And smaller U.S. suppliers, already operating on tight margins, couldn't scale up fast enough to fill the gap. What followed was chaos. Deere was forced to idle shifts and lay off workers at plants in Iowa and Illinois. Ford slowed production across Michigan, citing severe parts shortages. Hundreds of smaller manufacturers across the Midwest started reporting layoffs and sharp revenue drops. Lead times doubled, then tripled. Equipment prices exploded. Tractors and vehicles that once took weeks to deliver now took months. And it didn't stop there. The impact rippled across the country. Consumers were suddenly facing thousands of dollars in extra costs when buying cars. Farmers were forced to delay harvest upgrades. Construction companies hit pause on projects because of equipment delays. Inflation crept into corners of the economy Trump had promised to protect. What was supposed to be a patriotic push to bring jobs home had turned into a logistical nightmare, crippling the very industries it claimed to save. Instead of an industrial comeback, America found itself grappling with uncertainty, scarcity, and rising prices. Trump had promised an economic revival. What he delivered was an economic reckoning. The tariffs were meant to send a message, punish corporations for outsourcing jobs, protect American workers, and bring manufacturing back home. But as the dust settled, it became painfully clear the ones being punished weren't the CEOs or boardroom elites. It was the farmers, the factory workers, and the small business owners, the very people Donald Trump had sworn to protect. With supply chains buckling and prices skyrocketing, a terrifying realization began to spread across the country. This wasn't just about trade policy. This was a full-blown battle for the future of American industry. And as the economic war intensified, another powerful force began to stir: America's working class. They weren't going to sit quietly anymore. Trump's war had started with corporations, but now it was creeping into a far more dangerous territory: his own base. As workers rose up at home, frustrated and cornered, the rest of the world was also preparing to strike back. Trade partners eyed retaliation. International markets braced for instability. And just when it seemed like the backlash couldn't get any worse, Trump made his boldest move yet. In late 2025, at a rally that felt more like a battle cry than a campaign event, Trump unveiled what he called his final gambit. With fire in his voice and flags waving behind him, he declared a sweeping 25% tariff on every imported manufactured product. Auto parts, farm equipment, construction materials, consumer electronics, all of it. The message was crystal clear. If companies wanted to move American jobs overseas, they would now pay a steep price. This wasn't just about Ford or John Deere anymore. Trump had effectively declared economic war on the entire global manufacturing system. He framed it as the ultimate patriotic stand, telling his supporters, if these companies want to outsource American jobs, they'll pay the price. The crowd roared. The slogans flew. But beyond the rally grounds, panic set in. Economists warned of catastrophic inflation. Business leaders scrambled to revise forecasts. Small manufacturers feared collapse under the weight of supply disruptions and soaring costs. Consumers braced for another wave of price hikes. What had once been a calculated economic strategy had now spiraled into an all-out assault on the very structure of the American economy. Trump's final play was bold, loud, and uncompromising. But it wasn't just a gamble. It was a high-stakes bet on a vision of America that many no longer recognized. And now, with the entire global market watching and domestic tensions rising, the question wasn't whether Trump could win this war. It was whether anyone could survive it. Deere and Ford launched what many would later call the corporate counterstrike, a bold and public rejection of Trump's economic agenda that sent shockwaves through Wall Street, Washington, and rural America alike. In a joint press conference held simultaneously in Detroit and Moline, Illinois, the CEOs of both companies stepped to the podium with a message that was as clear as it was defiant. We will not be political pawns. We will not let policy built on fear and division destroy American industry. The statement wasn't just symbolic. It came with teeth. First, Ford announced it would accelerate its investment in electric vehicle, EV manufacturing, but not in the U.S., in Canada and the European Union, where trade relations were more stable and the policy environment more predictable. Billions in factory construction, battery production, and high-tech assembly lines would now bypass Michigan and Ohio entirely. At the same time, John Deere unveiled plans to expand major operations in Brazil and India, effectively doubling down on globalization just as Trump tried to crush it. Deere's CEO was blunt. We cannot operate in a world where policy whiplash puts our entire supply chain at risk. We are building for long-term sustainability, not short-term politics. The reaction was immediate. Trump supporters were furious. Conservative media accused the companies of turning their backs on America. Hashtags like hashtag Deere Traders and hashtag Ford Fails trended for days. But investors? They cheered. Both companies saw modest recoveries in their stock prices as analysts praised the clarity and decisiveness of their strategies. Wall Street understood the game had changed. This wasn't just about one administration's tariffs anymore. It was about future-proofing operations in a globalized economy.